She adjusted her lipstick one last time, never looking at him, her voice light as if she were commenting on the weather. "Tonight is important for me. Can you pretend you are not with me?" Daniel Brooks nodded. Just one word, "Okay." The car stopped at a red light. Rain slid down the windshield in thin blurred streaks, mirroring the sensation spreading through his chest. Lena Harper sat in the passenger seat, back straight, hands neatly on her lap, radiating the energy of someone about to step into a room where she believed her future was waiting. She did not notice how unusually silent Daniel had become. She did not realize that in that moment, the relationship she treated as a launchpad had been quietly pushed out of its orbit by her own hand. That sentence was not the first betrayal. It was simply the final receipt, printed clearly, impossible to dispute. Daniel was 37 years old, his face unremarkable, his presence calm, the kind of man often labeled safe, predictable, not worth showing off. He worked in logistics operations, a behind-the-scenes world where everything had to run smoothly so others could stand under the spotlight. To Lena, his job was stable but dull, not interesting enough to appear in her networking stories. In 5 years together, Daniel had been the one leasing the apartment, registering the car, paying for the trips that appeared on Lena's social media tagged with words like spontaneous and living the dream. In return, he learned to slow his steps behind her at events, to smile when introduced as a friend, an acquaintance, someone supportive. He told himself this was love, giving without demanding. The light turned green. Daniel drove on. Lena talked about the party, a new agency launch, important people, potential investors, a man named Marcus she mentioned casually, with a tone that seemed to wait for a reaction. Daniel did not ask more. He was already seeing something clearer than any explanation. As they neared the venue, the air inside the car shifted. Lena exhaled, then turned to him with her familiar smile. She repeated her request, this time with details. "Park around the corner. Wait a bit before coming in. If anyone asks, say you are a friend. Do not stand close to me. Do not touch me. Just a few hours." Daniel listened as each word landed without noise, without collision. A cold clarity spread through him. Not pain, not anger, just absolute understanding, like the moment a complex system finally reveals its point of failure. He smiled, not a forced smile, but one so calm that Lena hesitated. "Really?" she asked, surprised. "You are not upset?" He said no. He wanted her to have exactly what she was looking for. Lena felt relieved. She did not realize that this was not surrender. It was consent to an ending he was already prepared for. The car stopped. Golden light from the venue spilled onto the wet pavement. Lena opened the door and stepped out, confident, upright, as if every choice she made was reasonable. Before closing the door, she reminded him to wait. Then she walked away, without turning back. Daniel watched. One breath, then he turned the wheel. The car did not circle the block as she expected. It turned away from the lights, heading back toward the apartment they called home. The radio stayed off. The city passed in silence. In his mind, everything lined up neatly. What to keep, what to leave, what was not worth arguing over. Elsewhere, Lena entered the party with a perfect smile, believing she had managed the situation. She did not know that real power had never belonged to the most visible person in the room. It belonged to the one who could walk away without explaining. And that night, while Lena believed she was stepping closer to the life she imagined, Daniel Brooks quietly began a chain of deliberate, controlled actions that would cause everything she relied on to collapse without a single act of revenge. Daniel Brooks did not return to the apartment to cry. He returned to pack. The door closed behind him, the sound of the lock sharp and final, like a period placed exactly where it belonged. The apartment was bathed in soft yellow light, so quiet he could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock. Everything looked the same as it had a few hours earlier. The sofa Lena loved, the framed photos where she always chose the better angle of her face, the scented candles he paid for but never truly liked. Daniel stood still for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but observation, the way he always did at work. No emotion, just data, space, priorities. In his mind, a list formed automatically. What belonged to him, what did not, And what, even if he had paid for it, was not worth taking. This was why Daniel was always underestimated. Anyone seeing him then would assume he was a man who had been abandoned. Pretending to be strong, they would not know he had managed crises that nearly brought multi-million-dollar supply chains to collapse. They would not understand that when chaos hit, Daniel did not panic, he organized. He went straight into the bedroom. No hesitation. 2 suitcases came out of the closet and were placed neatly on the floor. He did not throw things in, did not rush. Every movement was precise, efficient, as if he had trained for this moment long ago. Shirts, jackets, shoes, laptop, passport, folders of documents Lena had never touched because she considered them boring work-related things. A small photo sat on the nightstand. Daniel and Lena on their first trip together. She was smiling brightly. He stood slightly to the side. As always, Daniel picked it up and looked at it for a few seconds. There was no replay of memories. No sharp ache, just one clear thought. This version of them no longer existed. He placed the photo face down. He did not throw it away. He did not take it with him. In the bathroom, Daniel gathered his personal items into a small bag. Razor, toothbrush, the small things that carried absolute ownership. Everything else stayed. Soft towels, expensive cosmetics, objects Lena considered achievements. Daniel considered them sunk costs. His phone vibrated as the clock approached 10 in the evening. Lena's name appeared on the screen. Daniel did not answer, not out of anger, but because that call no longer ranked as a priority. Elsewhere in the city, Lena stood amid music and laughter. Phone in hand, staring at the unanswered screen. She frowned as a faint irritation crept in. Daniel usually replied quickly. Always available, always there. She told herself he was probably parked nearby, doing exactly what she had asked. She did not know that at that moment, Daniel was opening his banking app, separating their shared accounts with a few clean taps. No message left, no explanation. The system recorded only numbers shifting. Silent, cold, irreversible. Daniel zipped the suitcases closed. He stood in the apartment one last time. He did not look around to remember. He looked to confirm. Everything was done. Before leaving, he placed the keys on the kitchen counter. Right beside them, the spare phone he had once bought for Lena. A small detail, but he knew when she came home, it would be the first thing she noticed. Daniel stepped outside. The door closed. This time, there was no lock. It was no longer necessary. At the party, Lena finally called again. The ringing lasted longer. Daniel answered. His voice was calm. She asked where he was, whether he could come pick her up. In her tone, Daniel heard a trace of confusion he had rarely heard before. He replied slowly, saying he was still pretending. The call ended. Lena stood still for a few seconds, staring at the dark screen. A strange sensation ran down her spine. Not fear, but a subtle loss of control. Like when something that had always stayed in place suddenly disappeared. At the same time, Daniel Brooks drove away from the neighborhood. He did not look back. He did not need a map. He was not running. He was moving forward. And in the quiet of the city at night, a truth began to take shape. The person who truly holds power in any relationship is not the one who receives the most attention. It is the one who can leave while the other still believes they're being chosen. Daniel Brooks did not return to the apartment to cry. He returned to pack. The door closed behind him. The sound of the lock sharp and final. Like a period placed exactly where it belonged. The apartment sat under soft yellow light. So quiet he could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock. Everything looked the same as a few hours earlier. The sofa Lena loved. The framed photos where she always chose the better angle of her face. The scented candles he paid for but never truly liked. Daniel stood still for a moment. Not out of nostalgia but observation. The way he always did at work. No emotion, just data, space, priorities. In his mind, a list formed automatically. What belonged to him, what did not, and what, even if he had paid for it, was not worth taking. This was why Daniel was always underestimated. Anyone seeing him then would assume he was a man who had been abandoned. Pretending to be strong, they would not know he had handled crises that nearly caused multi-million-dollar supply chains to collapse. They would not understand that when chaos arrived, Daniel did not panic. He organized. He went straight into the bedroom without hesitation. 2 suitcases came out of the closet and were placed neatly on the floor. He did not throw things in. He did not rush. Every movement was precise and efficient, as if he had trained for this moment long ago. Shirts, jackets, shoes, laptop, passport, folders of documents Lena had never touched because she considered them boring work-related things. A small photo sat on the nightstand. Daniel and Lena on their first trip together. She was smiling brightly. He stood slightly to the side. As always, Daniel picked it up and looked at it for a few seconds. There was no replay of memories. No sharp ache. Just one clear thought. This version of them no longer existed. He placed the photo face down. He did not throw it away. He did not take it with him. In the bathroom, Daniel gathered his personal items into a small bag. Razor, toothbrush, the small things that carried absolute ownership. Everything else stayed. Soft towels, expensive cosmetics. The objects Lena considered achievements. Daniel considered them sunk costs. His phone vibrated as the time approached 10 in the evening. Lena's name appeared on the screen. Daniel did not answer, not out of anger, but because that call no longer ranked as a priority. Elsewhere in the city, Lena stood amid music and laughter. Phone in hand, staring at the unanswered screen. She frowned as a faint irritation crept in. Daniel usually replied quickly. Always available. Always there. She told herself he was probably parked nearby, doing exactly what she had asked. She did not know that at that moment, Daniel was opening his banking app, separating their shared accounts with a few clean taps. No message left. No explanation. The system recorded only numbers shifting. Silent. Cold. Irreversible. Daniel zipped the suitcases closed. He stood in the apartment one last time. He did not look around to remember. He looked to confirm. Everything was done. Before leaving, he placed the keys on the kitchen counter. Right beside them the spare phone he had once bought for Lena. A small detail, but he knew when she came home, it would be the first thing she noticed. Daniel stepped outside. The door closed. This time, there was no lock. It was no longer necessary. At the party, Lena finally called again. The ringing lasted longer. Daniel answered. His voice was calm. She asked where he was, whether he could come pick her up. In her tone, Daniel heard a trace of confusion he had rarely heard before. He replied slowly, saying he was still pretending. The call ended. Lena stood still for a few seconds, staring at the dark screen. A strange sensation ran down her spine. Not fear, but a subtle loss of control. Like when something that had always stayed in place suddenly disappeared. At the same time, Daniel Brooks drove away from the neighborhood. He did not look back. He did not need a map. He was not running. He was moving forward. And in the quiet of the city at night, a truth began to take shape. The person who truly holds power in any relationship is not the one who receives the most attention. It is the one who can leave while the other still believes they're being chosen. Lena's phone rang over and over inside the empty apartment, but there was no one left there to answer it. She stood frozen in the middle of the living room, heels still on, the hallway light spilling in and making the familiar space feel strangely larger and colder than before. There were no footsteps from Daniel. No calm voice asking if she was home. Only a thick, heavy silence pressing against her chest. Lena took a few steps forward and called his name. No response. Her eyes landed on the keys resting on the kitchen counter. Right beside them was the spare phone she had once used and forgotten. A small detail, but enough to throw her heartbeat off rhythm. Daniel never left things carelessly. If he placed it there, it meant he wanted her to see it. She opened the bedroom. 2 clear gaps stared back at her from the closet. The drawers on the left side, where Daniel kept his things, were nearly empty. She reached out and touched the space, as if contact alone might make him reappear. But there was nothing, only a sharp, unmistakable sense of loss spreading from her fingertips up her arm. Inside Lena's mind, everything began to tilt. She did not understand what was happening. Daniel had always been the stable one, the one who stayed, the one who never left. Throughout the relationship, she had never imagined a version of reality where he walked away first. She was used to being the center, the one setting the rhythm. Daniel was just the background. In another part of the city, Daniel sat inside a small hotel room, soft light filling the space. Curtains drawn halfway closed. He did not turn on the television. He did not check his phone. He sat at the desk. Laptop open, reading an email that had just been sent. The message was brief, precise, emotionless. His internal transfer request had been approved. New location, new role, start date in a few weeks. This was the twist no one had seen coming. Not even Lena. Daniel Brooks was not simply a man who had been abandoned. He was someone who had been preparing an exit for a long time, waiting only for the moment when everything became undeniably clear. Years earlier, while Lena was still building her image, Daniel had quietly been building real power. Professional relationships he never talked about. Projects he operated behind the scenes. Ensuring systems ran smoothly. He never needed the spotlight, because he controlled the switch. While Lena sat down on the sofa, clutching her head, trying to call Daniel again, his phone lay silent on the table. He saw her name light up the screen. One part of him recognized the panic beginning to form inside her. Another part remained calm. This was not revenge. This was consequence. Daniel remembered the times he had been introduced as just someone tagging along. The parties where he stood a step behind. The half-joking remarks about how safe and predictable he was. Back then, he had let it slide. Believing love required patience. Now he understood something else. Prolonged silence was not patience. It was self-erasure. He closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, shut his eyes for a moment. Not to grieve, but to acknowledge the strange sense of lightness settling in. For the first time in years, he was no longer adjusting himself to fit someone else's image. Back at the apartment, Lena stood up and moved from room to room as if searching for something she had dropped. She opened the refrigerator, pulled open drawers. Everything was still there, but the person who gave the place meaning was gone. Slowly, uncomfortably, she began to understand that Daniel had not left in a moment of impulse. He had left with a plan. A thought flashed through her mind, tightening her chest. If he could walk away like this, it meant he had never been as weak as she believed. At the same time, Daniel stepped onto the balcony. City lights stretching out beneath him. He took a deep breath. There was no sense of triumph. Only certainty. True power does not need to announce itself. It reveals itself most clearly when someone realizes too late that they have misjudged it. That night, Lena barely slept. Daniel, for the first time in a long while, slept deeply, without dreams. And at the fragile boundary between loss and awakening, both of them began to understand the same truth. Some people look ordinary, easy to overlook, until they walk away carrying the very foundation others assumed would always be there. The next morning, Lena woke up on the sofa with her phone dead in her hand and a sense of panic she had never felt before. The apartment was still, frighteningly quiet. Early sunlight filtered through the curtains and landed on the empty space in the bedroom where Daniel's belongings used to be. There were no new missed calls. No apologetic messages. This silence did not feel like an argument. It felt like a door that had closed completely. Lena stood up and rushed into the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror. Smudged mascara, messy hair, a face that still looked familiar on social media, yet strangely unfamiliar to herself. She told herself Daniel just needed time. He was always like that. Calm, slow, he would come back. But when she opened the closet and saw the empty drawers, a cold thought slid through her. This time was different. Across the city, Daniel had already been awake for hours. Not from sleeplessness but habit. He sat by the hotel window with a cup of black coffee. Laptop open, reviewing tasks as if starting a new project. In truth, he was. A project called his own life. A call came in from an unfamiliar number. Daniel answered. The voice on the other end was professional and efficient, confirming the internal transfer details. The new city, the new team, the new role. Daniel replied briefly and precisely. When the call ended, he closed the laptop, stood up, and put on his jacket. Everything was moving forward. Meanwhile, Lena began sending messages. At first they were short questions. Where are you? We need to talk. Then they grew longer, mixed with confusion and blame. I just need you to understand. Last night was only work. I did not think you would react like this. The messages kept coming, all falling into silence. She called a close friend. Her voice urgent. Daniel left. He did not say anything. On the other end, there was a pause before the response. He really left, not just upset. For the first time, Lena realized the way people saw Daniel might have been wrong. And perhaps she had been wrong too. Daniel walked into the company's temporary office around noon. No one there knew about his personal life. To them, he was the man brought in to fix problems others could not. As he entered, they did not see a man leaving a broken relationship. They saw someone in control. He shook hands, listened carefully, asked the right questions. Within hours, Daniel identified bottlenecks the team had struggled with for months. The atmosphere shifted. Curiosity turned into respect. This was the man Lena had never truly seen. Not because he hid it, but because she never looked closely enough. That afternoon, Lena went to the hotel Daniel usually stayed at on work trips. She stood at the front desk, forcing herself to stay calm, asking about him. The clerk shook their head. He had checked out early that morning. No forwarding information, no notes. He paid and left. This time, the loss of control was unmistakable. No longer a vague discomfort, but fear. Lena began to understand Daniel had not left to scare her. He had left because he had already chosen another path. As the sun set, Daniel stood on a bridge watching traffic flow beneath him. He remembered the moment Lena asked him to pretend not to be with her. In that instant, he had seen the entire picture. Not just about her, but about himself. He had lived too long in the role of the one who stayed behind. Until people forgot he could step forward at any time. Daniel's phone vibrated. A message from Lena. This time it was not blame. Just a short line asking if they could meet. Daniel read it and turned off the screen. Back in the apartment, Lena sat on the living room floor, leaning against the sofa, staring at the familiar objects around her. Everything was still there, except the sense of security. She began to understand that some people do not need to raise their voices to leave. And when they are gone, no explanation can bring them back. Night fell. The city lights came on. Daniel kept moving forward without looking back. Lena stayed behind, facing the truth for the first time. That real power does not belong to the one who is chosen most often, but to the one who can choose themselves and walk away when the time comes. Lena's post appeared on social media that morning, and it did not mention Daniel at all. It was just a photo of a cup of coffee by a window. Soft light, paired with a vague caption about learning to let go of things that no longer fit. She believed silence could control the narrative, that if she did not name him, he would drift back into his old place. What she did not know was that Daniel was no longer standing inside that story. At his new office, Daniel sat in a glass meeting room, listening as tension stretched tight across the table. A shipment delay, a partner threatening to pull out, department heads passing blame in circles. When Daniel spoke, the room went quiet, not because he raised his voice, but because he was right. He identified the choke points, reorganized the flow, reassigned responsibility. His voice was steady, stripped of excess emotion. 15 minutes later, the meeting ended with a clear direction and a sense of control restored. The looks left behind were no longer doubtful. They were respectful. This was the twist Lena had never witnessed. The man she once labeled safe and predictable now guiding a complex system with absolute composure. Meanwhile, the first cracks began to reach Lena. Her bank card was declined at her usual cafe. She tried again, then called the bank, forcing her voice to stay calm. The explanation was brief. The shared account had been separated. Everything legal, everything processed. She hung up, her hand trembling. This was no longer an emotional dispute. It was reality. She opened her laptop and checked her email. A message from the landlord appeared, stating the lease would be updated within 30 days. Daniel's name was gone. Only hers remained. Lena began to understand that this departure was not symbolic. It was precise, methodical, leaving no gaps. That evening, Daniel returned to his temporary apartment late, removed his watch, set it on the table, and looked out the window as the city lit up below. Life did not slow down for a broken relationship. His phone vibrated with a message from Lena. No blame this time, no hidden meaning, just a short, shaking line asking why everything had turned out this way. Daniel read it and did not respond. He knew that explaining now would only pull him back into the role of managing someone else's emotions by sacrificing his own boundaries. Back at the old apartment, Lena sat in the middle of the living room with her laptop open and her phone beside her. She scrolled through old photos. Trips. Moments where Daniel stood slightly behind her, always giving her the frame. For the first time, she saw how present he had been. Not as a shadow, but as a foundation. A memory surfaced of Daniel once saying he liked things that ran smoothly without needing to be displayed. She had laughed then, assuming it was how he comforted himself for not being flashy enough. Now those words echoed with a different meaning. Daniel opened his laptop and sent one more email. Brief and final. Confirming schedules. Closing one chapter and stepping into another. No room for hesitation. No space for turning back. That night, Lena did not post again. No metaphors. No reflections. She sat alone without an audience or validation, facing questions she had never allowed herself to ask. What she had underestimated, and who she had misjudged. At the same time, Daniel turned off the lights and lay down, feeling a rare stillness. Not emptiness, but the space required for a man to stand upright again. He did not feel victorious. But he knew this truth. Real power is not found in making someone regret losing you. It is found in no longer needing to be chosen. And when a man who was once treated as the foundation walks away, those who stood upon it are forced to confront the fact that they never learned how to stand on their own. The call came late at night. And this time Daniel answered. Not because he was wavering, but because the silence had already done its work. Lena's voice on the other end was no longer steady. No longer carried the familiar rhythm of someone used to controlling the story. There was only hurried breathing. Broken pauses between sentences. She said she was outside. That it was raining. That she did not have a spare key. That she just needed him to come pick her up. Just this once. Daniel listened. He did not look at the clock or the screen. He stared into the space in front of him, where the streetlights divided the darkness into clean lines. The same clear boundaries forming in his mind. A small part of him recognized Lena's genuine fragility. Another part understood that this was the exact moment when people undo their strongest decisions. He replied slowly and calmly, saying he could not, that she should call a friend, that he was busy. No explanation, no apology, no promise. On the other end, Lena fell silent for a few seconds, then asked softly when he had changed. The question brushed against years of memories. The times he stood behind her, endured quietly, was treated as insignificant. Daniel realized that for the first time, he no longer felt the need to prove anything. He told her he had not changed. He had only stopped making himself smaller. The call ended. Daniel set the phone down, stood up, and opened the window. Night air rushed in, carrying the damp scent of the city after rain. He breathed deeply. There was no sense of victory, only a steady relief, like a difficult decision finally completed. Somewhere else, Lena sat in the back of a taxi, her trembling hand resting the phone on her lap. She stared out the window at her reflection broken by raindrops. She had never seen herself like this. Not the chosen one, not the one in control. Just someone being refused, for the first time, without a way to turn it around. The next day, consequences continued to surface, cold and precise. Emails from the bank, reminders from the landlord, notes from the accountant about expenses Daniel had always handled without her noticing. Each message was a small stone, falling quietly but steadily, enough to make her understand that the foundation beneath her was no longer hers. Meanwhile, Daniel walked into an important meeting. The eyes around the table were not curious but expectant. A major project was on the verge of collapse due to a chain of poor decisions. Daniel listened, took notes, then spoke. Short sentences, clear, unwasted. He broke the problem down, reordered priorities, proposed a solution no one had considered because they were too focused on appearances. The room shifted with him. A new colleague leaned over and whispered to someone else, asking who he was. The answer came quickly. The man brought in to fix what others could not. This was the complete twist. Daniel had not walked away because he was weak. He walked away because he was strong enough not to stay. That afternoon, Lena sent another message. This time there was no pleading, no blame, just an honest question. If she apologized, would things be different? Daniel read it, then set the phone down without replying. He knew some apologies come too late not because of time, but because they are spoken after the right to ask has already been lost. That evening, Daniel ate a simple dinner alone. No music, no screens, fully present with himself. He reflected on the years behind him, not with regret, but with clarity, what he had learned, what he had given up, and when he had finally chosen himself. Across the city, Lena lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, her phone face down. She began to understand that the most painful part was not being left, but realizing that the person she had treated as obvious had lived for so long in a role that was never meant to be his. Night passed, the city quieted, and between two people who once shared the same frame, the distance was no longer measured in space. It was measured in awakening. And this time, only one of them had truly woken up. The final message Lena sent did not come from her phone. It came from someone else. Daniel realized this the moment he saw Marcus's name appear in his work inbox. Wedged between meeting schedules and progress reports, a misplaced subject line, written in haste, carrying the familiar confidence of someone who believed he held the upper hand. "We need to talk about Lena." Daniel read slowly, not out of surprise, but to understand just how far everyone had underestimated him. Marcus wrote that Lena was unstable, that she was not doing well, that Daniel should act like a grown man and stop disappearing like this. Between the lines sat a dangerous assumption, that Daniel still needed to be reminded of responsibility, that he was still standing in the background, waiting to be called back. Daniel smiled, barely. He did not reply. He forwarded the email to the company's legal department, where relationships were viewed through reality rather than emotion, then closed his laptop. The story had reached a point where his presence was no longer required for it to continue. In a cafe elsewhere in the city, Lena sat across from Marcus, both hands wrapped around a cup of water gone cold. Her eyes looked hollow. She told him everything: the silence, Daniel not returning, the cold, precise changes that left her no space to hold on. Marcus listened, confident at first, then frowning. He was not used to being pushed out of the center of the narrative. She said Daniel was not angry. And that was what frightened her most. Because when a man stops arguing, stops explaining, stops needing to be understood, it is not retreat, it is an ending. Marcus reassured her that Daniel was just playing a power game, that men like him always came back once given the right attention. Lena nodded, but deep down she knew he was wrong. She had lived with Daniel long enough to know that when he decided, there was no stage big enough to pull him back. At the same time, Daniel walked into an important presentation. Numbers filled the screen, translated into strategy with clarity and control. He spoke about flow, bottlenecks, about how a system that looked stable could collapse simply because a foundational element was misjudged. No one in the room knew his words applied to more than work. When the meeting ended, a senior executive pulled him aside and asked directly if he was willing to lead the entire division. Daniel did not answer immediately. He asked for a day, not to question his ability, but to confirm that nothing remained tying him to the role he had outgrown. That evening, Lena drove past the street where Daniel used to live. The lights in the apartment were off. A new family had moved in. She stopped for a few seconds, then drove on. Cities do not hold space for those who leave. And Daniel had left cleanly. She called him again, not to ask him back, only to say she understood now, that she had been wrong to assume he would always be there. The call went unanswered, but this time she did not feel angry. Only a slow, deep emptiness, like realizing you have lost something that cannot be bought back, repaired, or replaced. Daniel sat alone, watching the city lights from above. He remembered being labeled safe, predictable, the man who never left. He had once believed his value lay in unconditional presence. Now he understood that real value lay in knowing when to stand up and walk away. Somewhere else, Lena began to face the consequences of choices she had never paid for before. No one cleaning up behind her. No solid foundation to stand on. Daniel stepped into the next phase of his life with rare clarity. Some people only feel the weight of a foundation when it is no longer beneath their feet. And some people, once they rise from being underestimated, never return to prove anything again. The meeting took place at a small riverside cafe, a place Daniel once said he liked because no one went there to impress anyone. Lena arrived early and chose a table in the corner with her back to the window, as if she did not want to see her own reflection. When Daniel walked in, she stood up out of old habit, then stopped herself. He had not changed much. The same calm posture, the same simple jacket, eyes that no longer searched for validation. What unsettled her was not coldness, but the feeling that he had crossed into a different world where she no longer had a place. Daniel sat down without hugging her, without asking how she was, only nodding in polite acknowledgement, like two former colleagues meeting by chance. Lena swallowed hard. She had prepared many things to say, but facing him, they dissolved into silence. She began slowly, talking about misunderstandings, pressure, how she had not recognized his value until he left. Her voice trembled as she mentioned the nights alone in the empty apartment. She said she did not need things to return to how they were. She only wanted a chance. One real conversation. Daniel listened, his gaze steady, neither avoiding nor holding on. He let her speak until the emotions ran their course. When she stopped, the space between them grew quiet, the sound of water flowing outside becoming clearer. He spoke softly, saying he believed she was sincere, that she was truly seeing what she had overlooked before. Then added a sentence light as air and heavy as stone, that it was no longer enough. Lena stared at him, stunned, asking why. He answered that realization after loss is not always an invitation to return. Sometimes it is simply a lesson arriving on time for the one who remains. She brought up memories, moments when he had promised to always be there. Daniel nodded, not denying them, saying he had been there for a very long time. So long that he forgot staying should be a mutual choice, not a silent obligation. The twist came when she asked where he had gone and what he had been doing. Daniel replied briefly, new work, a new role, a new team he was leading. He did not boast, yet every word carried a steadiness she had never seen before. Not because he hid it, but because she had never looked deeply enough. For the first time, she realized the man she treated as a foundation had become the architect of his own life. Without a stage, without an audience, Lena was silent for a long moment, then asked if things would have been different had she chosen differently back then. Daniel looked toward the river and said perhaps. But life does not operate on late hypotheticals. It runs on choices made while we still have the right to choose. He stood first, placed money on the table, thanked her for coming, wished her well. No bitterness, no anger, and that kindness hurt more than cruelty ever could, because it confirmed he did not need to hate her to leave. As Daniel walked outside, the late afternoon sun fell across his shoulders. Lena remained seated, watching through the glass. This time there was no urge to chase him, only a quiet truth settling in, that some people do not leave to punish. They leave because they have learned everything they needed to learn in that place. Daniel walked along the river, his steps steady, feeling no victory, only lightness, free from carrying an old version of himself to please someone else. Behind him, Lena sat alone, for the first time not trying to rewrite the story, letting it be broken, honest, irreversible, finally understanding that real power is not in being kept, but in being able to move forward without looking back. The meeting ended without tears or promises, ending instead with clarity, sometimes the most painful ending of all, and the only beginning left that is true. News about Daniel reached Lena not through him, but through a photo she stumbled upon while scrolling late at night. There was no long caption, no dramatic backstory, just a distant shot from an internal conference where Daniel stood in front of a large screen. Marker in hand, eyes focused, the entire room silent as they listened to him. The short description beneath it made her heart falter. Newly appointed regional operations lead. Lena stared at the screen. Zoomed in, zoomed out, as if looking closer might reveal something familiar. A trace of hesitation, a crack. There was none. The man in the photo was no longer the one who used to step back so she could shine. He stood at the center. Understated, unannounced, unmistakably in charge. She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair. Her new apartment was smaller, quieter. There were no expensive things bought with shared money. No sense of safety that once came from someone else's silent presence. There was only her, and thoughts she could not escape. In another city, Daniel finished work late and left the office as hallway lights dimmed. He did not see himself as successful in the way people usually described it. He simply felt aligned, each decision clear, each relationship defined by boundaries. No one above him, no one behind him. A younger colleague asked him while waiting for the elevator how to know when it was time to leave something you had held onto for a long time. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. When staying requires you to shrink yourself every day, that is no longer loyalty. It is delay. Elsewhere, Lena began noticing small but sharp changes. Invitations grew sparse. Messages that once came easily arrived slower. No one said anything outright, but she felt it. Without Daniel quietly handling what no one saw, things slipped out of rhythm. Bills, missed appointments, details she had never paid attention to before. She thought about messaging him again. Not to ask him back, just to say she finally understood. But when she opened the chat, she stopped. Some words no longer connect. They only ease the speaker. Daniel did not know about that moment. He was cooking a simple dinner in his new kitchen. No effort, no camera, no one waiting. He played soft music, chopped vegetables, felt present in each movement. A peace he had never known before, because he had always adjusted it to fit someone else's emotions. That night, Lena walked past a small exhibition, light and laughter spilling out, reminding her of days she once believed were her best life. She stood outside the glass, looked in, then kept walking. For the first time, she did not force herself into a space just to prove she belonged. She understood then that the deepest pain was not that Daniel had left, but that he had risen, without turning back, without carrying her image into his new life. Elsewhere, Daniel stood by the window, watching the city at night. He thought about who he used to be. A man who believed standing behind someone was love. He felt no regret, because that version taught him what he needed to learn. But he also knew he would never return to that role again. Some separations do not end with tears or bitterness. They end with uneven growth. One person remains with questions. The other walks on with answers. And in the quiet of diverging roads, the truth becomes clear. The one who leaves is not the one who loses. The one who loses is the one who only recognizes the value of the foundation after it is no longer beneath their feet. Daniel realized he had truly entered a different chapter of his life the morning he woke up without thinking about Lena. Not because the memories were gone, but because they no longer held control. Sunlight filled his new apartment, warming the wooden floor that still carried the clean scent of a place slowly becoming home. He brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching people below begin their day. No one knew who he was. No one expected anything from him except himself. Strangely, that felt like the purest form of freedom he had ever known. In another city, Lena woke up to a quiet room. No familiar footsteps. No silent presence that once made her believe everything would always be fine. She sat up and looked around, and for the first time did not rush to fill the emptiness with work or carefully shaped stories. She let the emptiness exist, allowed it to say what it needed to say. Daniel moved through his workday with clear focus. He no longer worked to prove his worth. He worked because he was good at it, and because he chose to be there. In a meeting, when someone mentioned retaining people with vague promises, Daniel said one short sentence: "People stay only where they do not have to make themselves smaller." The room fell silent, not in disagreement, but in recognition of a truth rarely spoken. That afternoon, he received a message from an unfamiliar number. Not from Lena, just someone who had known them both, reaching out casually and referencing the past with a hint of regret. Daniel read it and replied politely, without avoidance and without depth. He no longer needed to shut the door tightly, because he had walked far enough that it was no longer behind him. Meanwhile, Lena began making small changes. Not dramatic ones, not announced to anyone, just different choices. She declined an invitation she once would not have missed. She started learning how to handle the things she had long left to someone else. Some days she missed Daniel, but it was no longer a desire to pull him back. It felt more like a late recognition of the value of what she once treated as obvious. The final twist was not whether they would reunite. It was that neither of them remained the same person. Daniel did not become cold or closed off. He became a man who knew where his boundaries were. Lena did not completely fall apart. She learned how to stand alone without leaning on someone else as her foundation. One evening, Daniel walked home after work as the sky turned the color of dusk. He thought about the road behind him, not with pride, but with acknowledgement. He had been underestimated, not because he was small, but because he chose silence. And he learned that silence only has value when it is chosen, not endured. Somewhere else, Lena stood in front of a mirror, looking at herself without adjusting, without posing. She whispered a quiet promise to herself. Next time, look more carefully at the person beside you. Not because they might leave, but because they might be holding your entire world without you realizing it. Life does not always teach lessons with thunder or dramatic falls. Sometimes it teaches through prolonged silence. Through someone leaving without blame. Through the realization that real power does not lie in being chosen, but in choosing yourself. Daniel opened the door to his apartment, set his keys down, and turned on the light. Another day came to an end. Not dramatic, not tragic, but deeply real. And within that calm, the story completed its circle.